All right, I can see people are starting to join. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick. I'm a partner CEO at Board of Innovation, and I'm joined today by Gabriel, and we'll be having a fireside chat for the next 20 minutes about agentic workflows and how AI is changing the world of work. I'm going to start with a quick introduction of Gabriel, and then we'll dive into a wide-ranging conversation about all these topics. So, Gabriel is the CEO and co-founder of Dust. Dust is transforming how enterprises work by enabling their teams to build AI assistants that can basically work within their tech stack and leverage their proprietary knowledge using different LLMs in their own technology, and they're working across thousands of teams for companies like Photoroom, Conto, etc. He founded the company together with Stanislas Polu from OpenAI, and they've grown it into a Sequoia-backed platform that is, scaling very rapidly. One of the topics that I'm hoping we'll be able to address. And today we're going to be talking about how AI is augmenting human capabilities in the workplace today and tomorrow. I want to, before I answer the first question, I want to encourage the audience to ask any questions using the Q&A session, particularly if you have any controversial point of views or you disagree with what's being said. We're aiming to make this a vibrant conversation with everybody, so please just drop in your thoughts there. Hey,
I promise
Gabriel.
I'll make it feel as much as a fire like a fireside chat by keeping the lights on by moving my arms now and again, so it feels like I'm
Cool.
putting another log in the fire.
Perfect. Um, maybe as a starting question, Gabriel, I'm curious, before we dive into sort of your personal journey and how you got about this founding Dust, could you maybe tell a bit more about what Dust is? How does it differ from the enterprise ChatGPT version that I'm guessing most of the audience is currently using?
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people will be familiar with ChatGPT, whether it as a B2C consumer or within a team or a larger organization. So I'll use it as a comparison point. First of all, thank you very much for having me, Nick, and it's a delight to be chatting with you all tonight. We're essentially trying to make three promises come true. The first one is that we fundamentally believe that a lot of the very valuable use cases for AI assistants or AI agents, you can call them what you want, we can have that debate, that can concretely be reached today require very precise understanding of the internal company context. So connecting large language models, sometimes frontier models, sometimes smaller models, it's going to depend, to this internal context is absolutely crucial. And getting that right is not easy. So that's something we spend a lot of our time on and something that differentiates us from platforms that are going to make the model and the interaction with the model easy, but not necessarily work as much on the internal context of the company. The second promise we're trying to make happen is that we don't believe companies are really too excited about committing to a single lab for their AI models. As recently as last week, everybody's been getting increasingly interested in DeepSeek and what have they done and is it true and how powerful is this model? I think that is just one of the signs that this ecosystem is incredibly fast moving, and enterprises that are looking to future-proof their business and give their companies the maximum opportunities need to be open to that optionality in the future. So we offer access to all the leading models and also access to smaller open source models, as well as models that may sometimes be running on the devices of the users. That layer of abstraction is important. And the third
Right.
promise, which I think is the most important, is we really believe that bottoms-up use cases are the most concrete way to drive value right now. And the product is designed to give teams a lot of empowerment, a lot of freedom to explore, design, deploy, and then maintain these assistants, rather than be bottlenecked on a single centralized project that's trying to come up with POCs and taking months to deploy. So that's maybe one of the largest differences that we have with other products.
Right, clear. Maybe before we dive into sort of how agentic workflows are going to impact how we work, you mentioned DeepSeek. I'm curious, are you adding or have you already added that model to the platform? And if not, curious why.
No, we have. We did it a few days ago. We're running it on an inference infrastructure that runs in the US. So, for those asking, no, it's not going to China with some of the fears that people had. It's an open source model that people can run from any infrastructure that is capable of running it. In particular, DeepSeek R1 seems to be really promising on high reasoning situations. So we can maybe go into more details there, but I think there's a huge difference to be made between classic conversational exchanges. I've got a question, I've got a small problem, I need to maybe draw a diagram or analyze some data, and much more complex use cases that may require minutes, sometimes dozens of minutes of chain of thought, step-by-step thinking. And that model is performing very well on our benchmarks, and so we've decided to make it available alongside the O1 reasoning model that OpenAI offers in use cases where we believe our users may benefit from it.
Great, cool. Then, if for people that want to try it out, I would encourage them to get a free demo on your website. I'm curious, how do you see those agentic workflows starting to impact how people work within your clients? And would maybe be interesting if you could share some of the more interesting or edge use cases that you have seen. What's working, and also where isn't it yet working yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just give a bit of context on why we chose to call our assistants last year, and why we may keep that name or change that name in the near future. Because I do believe that there's a fundamental difference between an assistant and an agent. We launched at the beginning of 2023, and our first goal was to achieve broad adoption within teams across the different functions, across the different divisions, because we think that's where there's tremendous upside, making information flow better between marketing and engineering, between engineering and hiring, between hiring and legal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the use cases that started to be explored and have success on Dust with our customers were in some cases very simple internal knowledge retrieval, internal knowledge management use cases that help people see the value of an assistant in a concrete way without having to get a PhD in AI or hours of training. And that was one of the ways in which we felt adoption would be favorable. Agents or agentic workflows tend to point to more end-to-end automation. And there's two questions to ask ourselves in this case. I think one of our mantras is replacing less than augmenting. We're more focused on augmenting humans, not just because we're trying to take a naive perspective on what's going on, but because we actually think there's a lot more value in bringing an exoskeleton to humans that understand how to do their job in a quite unique way and accelerate them in many different ways along the day than there is to try and fully understand how to automate a job from A to Z. I think people sometimes confuse people's roles and people's tasks, and it's very rare that a person's entire role within a company can be summarized by just the tasks that they complete. They often have a lot of undocumented value, which is sharing knowledge, enabling others to get trained or ramped up more quickly, et cetera, et cetera. The other difference between assistants and agents is that with agents, we're generally thinking about workflows that can have many more steps. So as opposed to a conversational interface, as opposed to a chatbot interface, we may be sending agents to do work and come back in 10 minutes or come back in an hour. And so the type of interface that's going to be useful for that is going to change a lot. Right now, most of the use cases for Dust are in a conversational setting. Maybe the platform triggers the conversation, maybe the user triggers the conversation, but it's still a back and forth. But as latency is going to increase, we believe that the interfaces are going to need to change. And that's why we're considering focusing more on this orchestration of agents as these models increase in performance on complex tasks. Now, to go back to your question around the use cases that we see have tremendous value, first of all, I'm always surprised and amazed at the creativity that the teams are displaying. They're really trying to connect the dots internally between teams and functions that had previously suffered from not having access to internal tools or the appropriate engineering resources to make these use cases happen. So I'll just give a few that maybe the audience won't have heard before. We have some engineers that are creating newsletters to go through all the sales call transcripts that the sales team is taking and identify and extract the moments where customers or prospects are talking about their own projects. So me, Gabriel, I'm working on Project Alpha, and I want to have a summary of every time that anybody talks about Project Alpha on the sales team. And I'm especially interested in understanding if people have committed to a deadline that I don't think is reasonable, because I'm going to have a conversation with the sales team. That's a very concrete use case where two different functions that generally work on very different software stacks have an opportunity to communicate automatically in a language that both parties are going to understand to accelerate the team and create value. Another use case is the other way around, marketing teams that are asking Dust assistants to interpret the way the code base is changing so that they can immediately understand which features are live for which customers without having to translate the code or understand it themselves. And a third use case that I think is tremendously powerful and that we see a lot of C-suite executives using on Dust is the ability to query databases for live information and quantitative results using SQL query assistance without knowing any SQL. Now, configuring the access to the databases that are going to make sense and being able to ask while in between calls on your phone or with the keyboard, hey, how many users do we have this week that have increased their usage by more than 20%? How are we doing in Belgium? Questions that used to take hours or days to get an answer from the analytics team back on that I think can now be automated and streamlined quite nicely.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that you mentioned in our backstage conversation was that you actually see very high engagements across the platform. With I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, about over 80% of people using it on a weekly basis. I wonder, do you believe if that's driven by the fact that people are actually building their own workflows and are aiming to solve their own problems? Because typically that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing in any digital transformation program is that the adoption just isn't there, or it's requiring a huge push. While this one feels more user pulls, if I'm
this goes back to the third priority, the third promise that I mentioned. Like, we really trust that teams generally know what needs to get done. It's just that for 10 or 15 years, they haven't had the opportunity to directly use the tools that are going to allow them to get it done. And so actually in some of our customers, it's more than 80% of the entire company that's using us daily, not weekly. And the scale at which they're deploying custom assistants can sometimes be that, 1 in 5 people on the instant messaging system is actually an assistant. We have this at a couple of our customers where more than 20% of the user accounts that people are interacting with on Slack are actually specialized assistants that are responding to certain tasks. I think it all comes back down to trust and empowerment. We're seeing with this software the amazing opportunity to empower teams to describe in very simple terms what their business needs are and to create very short feedback loops to improve their day-to-day in ways that usually you had to wait weeks or months to get some concrete value on. And so because of our product is a horizontal platform that can be used by marketing teams, by HR teams, by engineering teams, people are getting inspiration from the best in class across these different functions. And they start seeing that, analyzing vendor contracts to understand liability clauses or analyzing competitor websites to understanding if the wording has changed is actually the same set of AI Lego bricks. They're just applied to different verticals and different use cases. But by seeing what other teams are able to do and connecting the builders, the champions of this generation of technology, they're able to really learn from the best. I think what we're also seeing is this amazing period where curious, empowered, confident employees and team members want to get their hands on this technology. They want to show what they're able to do with it. And so there's a humongous positive energy and flywheel effect within the teams that have empowered their employees. I really think there's a distinction to be made between teams that are looking to automate jobs and fire the people that used to do those jobs. I don't think adoption is going to go faster there, or at least if it is, it's going to be very top down. And teams that have communicated with their employees, hey, we want to give you the best tools. We think you deserve the best tools. Let's discover together how we can make your day-to-day happen. And I think by increasing the trust and the access to internal data, a lot of the companies that we work with are just seeing a lot more adoption than they'd planned.
Do you see the adoption or profiles of the type of companies that you're working with change? Like, how would you basically paint the landscape in terms of like who are going to be the leaders in adopting these new tools and augmenting, I guess, the human capital of their workforce versus companies where you see more challenges in the adoption? I'm curious, do you have any insights in terms of like maybe the type of leaders or the type of companies that are going to be at the forefront of this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If I was to try and synthesize the common traits that we see between the companies that are the fastest in adopting this technology, I'd say it's a combination of top-down leadership and optimism with what this technology can do. So executive committees, leadership teams that are willing to really say, we believe this technology can have a positive effect across the company, and we want the teams to explore, and we want the teams to explore fast. So we're going to give them um, a safe, secure sandbox to start exploring, and bottoms up, where teams have access to the data that can empower them. I think there's really a tremendous competitive advantage for teams that have more internal transparency and more internal access to data from across functions. Now, if you ask an engineer at some companies and ask them what they think marketing is doing, you'd see a broad spectrum of awareness. Some engineering teams have no idea what marketing is doing, but some engineering teams actually have access to a lot of how marketing communicates internally on their priorities, their challenges, and their struggles. And the teams that have access to that data now have the tools to go and fetch it, package it, use it, and contextualize their priorities. So I think that's really the competitive advantage that's at play here.
Maybe just to weave in a question from the audience, from Curtis, is the whole access to that data, specifically because it's across silos and like integrating it within an existing enterprise tech stack, is that a big roadblock that you're facing, or is that actually one of those things that's typically overestimated, but once you get started, it's easy to solve? Like, yeah, how curious how
Yeah,
does it
it's a
actually work with people?
fascinating topic, and I won't be able to go into the level of detail that this topic deserves, but I really encourage people who want to go and have a look at an article that we shared on our blog, I think just a couple of days ago, about data and access controls. Um, some companies have decided to be incredibly strict and incredibly siloed in how they manage information because that's the safe way to do things. I think some other companies have understood that there's always a tension between business opportunity and business risk and are trying to manage those constraints in a more nuanced way. What we observe is that when we have security and safety audits with the teams that we serve, there's generally, first of all, an appreciation that the world is not perfect today. Like, people don't have the access controls that they think they have. And so being able to audit it and review it for new use cases is an opportunity to actually decide, are these silos that we created years ago still justified given the new business practices that we want to encourage? Secondly, I think that having by default more empowerment and more trust with the teams of humans, and less constraints in the software allows for these emergent use cases to be explored and tested. So what we generally end up encouraging and sometimes pushing our customers to do is to just test what the value of freeing that data up can be. Now, in certain cases, whether it's a legal or a regulatory constraint, that data does need to remain very, very siloed. And of course, you want to give your customers the controls and the monitoring to make sure that their employees are doing what they should be doing. But I think it's a nuanced conversation. If I was to compare it to something, it's like the cloud conversation of 10, 15 years ago. You had companies that decided to adopt it very quickly, companies that decided not to adopt it at all. I'd argue that most of the hyperscaler cloud providers today are safer than most of the on-premise providers that have kept their stacks that are now aging and hard to maintain. So it's that kind of nuance that I think leadership teams are really looking to have as a conversation.
Great. And we just shared the link to the blog post as well in the chat. So if anybody would like to dive deeper, I would encourage them to go there. I'd love to maybe for us to zoom out. I think we have about 1 minute left. If you look at the sort of broader societal impact that these AI assistants will have on augmenting human capabilities, the rise or not rise of agents that are potentially taking over parts of that workflow, like, I'm curious, what's your overall outlook? Like, how optimistic versus pessimistic are you? I'm guessing you're an optimist. I'm also curious to see if you could maybe highlight some of the risks or things that you're concerned about.
Yeah, I think it's important to be, broadly optimistic and micro realistic, because otherwise I think we end up being naive and sometimes disconnected. I think new technology has allowed us to live longer, be healthier, travel to places that we've never been before, and discover ways to understand the world around us that are very powerful. So I'm broadly optimistic on technology. I think that the pace at which this technology is deployed is a question for our societies broadly that needs to be taken very seriously, given the impact it could have. I would liken it to the outsourcing and globalization revolutions of the 1970s and 1980s. It's not the different mechanism, but it is at a pace and a scale that may force us to rethink it with the depth and thoughtfulness that is required. So the transient period may, in some cases, be challenging, but I'm broadly optimistic about the outcome for us as a whole.
Great. All right, we have about 30 seconds left, so maybe one final personal question. What's your favorite information resource to stay up to date on everything that's going on? Blog, websites, book?
I cheat, but It's one of the engineers I work next to who generally does a lot of the filtering for me, sleeps a lot less than I do, and keeps me updated.
Cool. All right.